started. Today's webinar is titled Expanding the Options to Create Safety, Supporting Healing for Males Who Have Experienced Trauma. It will be presented by Peter Pollard and Oswald Thomas. Mr. Pollard is a visiting fellow at the Office of Victims of Crime, U.S. Department of Justice. He's worked there for 30 years as a violence prevention and intervention specialist, including 15 years as a state child protection social worker, as a public education director for 2 national organizations addressing sexual violence prevention and intervention, and as a group facilitator for males participating in intimate partner violence prevention programs. Mr. Thomas is a survivor of gun violence and the director of the chapter development and membership for Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice is a flagship project of the Alliance of Safety and Justice. He is helping to lead a national network of crime survivors that are joining together to share stories, create healing communities, and advocating for a justice system that prioritizes healing, prevention, and recovery over incarceration. Without further ado, please welcome Peter and Oswald.
Okay, well, welcome to you all. Thank you for your interest in this topic. I hope that we can have a lively conversation about it. I want to make one correction in what Hunter read. I thankfully haven't been at the Office for Victims of Crime for 30 years. I've been in the field for 30 years, but I've only been at OVC for about 1.5 years as a visiting fellow. So it's looking around and seeing other feds and the stress that they go through over 30 years makes me thankful that they are doing that really important work, and I've been spared from doing it. So my fellowship at the Office for Victims of Crime has focused on identifying the most effective ways of engaging men or people who identify as males who have experienced trauma and violence to help them seek help, to make it safe to seek help. And learning about the effectiveness of ways to engage men has been something I've been interested in for a long time. I used to watch, as a child protection worker, I'd watch young boys and girls who we identified as people who had been victimized when they were young, and especially the boys when they became 14 or 16 or 18, we'd suddenly start to see them as people who were perpetrating crimes and identify them as that. So figuring out how to engage them in a healing process has been something I've been interested in. Any of you who work with boys and men who've experienced trauma know that we're dealing with folks who don't want to be identified as victims because it's not safe, and they don't feel safe asking for help. So it's always a challenge, and I appreciate your interest in your joining us today. Aswad?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for this webinar, particularly highlighting the voice and the experiences and how we can, as a field, can better help male victims of violence. As Hunter mentioned, I am a survivor of gun violence, and one thing that I've experienced all of my life was trauma and violence. So being able to help provide support services and also opportunities for young men to share stories and come together is one of those things that continues to drive my work to this day. So I'm pretty excited that you all are joining on this webinar to talk more on how we can help male victims of violence to get the support and services that they need. For today's webinar, we're going to review the impact that violence and trauma have on people we serve. We'll also look at how expanding the way we as providers, as caretakers, and as policymakers interpret and respond to trauma-reactive behaviors and can help lead to healing and real change for boys and men. We will also explore the impacts of widely accepted norms on boys' behavior and how expanding their options for coping can create safer families, communities, and schools, and safer world as we are looking to prevent crime from happening. And also, we would like to hear from you all as part of the Q&A session to discuss how your Lincoln Systems of Care work address systematic and individual barriers to viewing boys and young adult men's trauma histories and Lincoln services. So throughout today's presentation, Peter and I will be going back and forth. So Peter will spend time talking about why we do this work.
All right, so that's a question that probably a lot of people ask you. Why the heck are you doing this work? I know I've always said that we didn't get into this field, any of us, by going through a list of classified ads and saying, oh, that looks like interesting work. We usually have some goal, some purpose, some reason that we really want to change the way things are done, change the way people who've been victimized experience that victimization. And really at the foundation for all of us, we come at it in different ways, but I think creating safe communities is a really important goal for a lot of us. I know in child protection, when I was doing that creating strong families was something that I felt really foundational to creating safe communities. Showing people that it's possible to change, that's a reality. So often we identify people according to their behaviors, and we'll be talking about that, but we see them according to an identity that's very singular, and it really is possible for people to change their behaviors. I think there's always the impulse to help people who've been injured. You see somebody who's suffering or who's traumatized, and you want to help. And I think also that it's important to recognize that a lot of us in the field are trying to heal ourselves, and actually the ones that are, I think, most effective in the field are the ones that are actively acknowledging that and accessing services to deal with their own reasons for being in the field. So that would be something that we'll be talking about that actually as the day goes on. Another reason, especially that we're doing this work with males, is that we want to help them recognize that the trauma has had an impact on them and has really shaped their lives and their worldview, and that their worldview is not necessarily something that they just came up with on their own, and it's been deeply impacted by the trauma they've experienced. And we want to try to help them stop the cycles of violence in their lives that are going on because nobody's dealing with the trauma generation to generation. I worked in child protection for 15 years and saw kids that I worked with as clients when they were children grow up and become parents, and realized that we never really helped them address their trauma, and that they were imposing that trauma of their own experience onto their children. We want to help them identify what makes them feel safe in asking for help and accessing help to heal and to make it meaningful and relevant to who they are and what their life experiences have been and what they've been through. And I think we all collectively believe that we want them to believe, and we believe that healing is possible through the sharing of stories and connecting to resources and services designed to help them heal. Now, I've just lost my connection to my computer, Aswad, so fortunately I'm on the phone, but you should forward the slide because I no longer can in the moment.
Yep, no problem, Peter. So navigating masculinity. So trauma is universal. Like women and boys, boys and men feel those same emotions, including empathy, fear, sadness, protectiveness, joy, love, vulnerability, and grief. When I was a victim of violence, a victim of gun violence, I was at the most vulnerable time that I had ever been in my life, and so the varies of emotions that I was going through, from those days of being sad, those days of being scared to go outside, those days of, seeing and being around the joy and love of my family. And so for me, trauma was something that helped shape my worldview about safety, helped shape my worldview about the lack of services and community. So primarily working with boys and men, we want to be able to, take those masculine norms and those things that can be physical, emotional, unsafe by shaming males who acknowledge or display the full range of emotions. So we want to be able to create those safe spaces for men and boys and men to share how they feel and being able to talk about their victim experiences in a way that is helping them heal as well.
That's why one of the things that I think is really important to note is that a lot of our systems, even some of our parenting systems, but certainly our discipline systems in schools and courts actually use shaming. There's a thread of shaming that runs through them often. And there's a belief that shaming can motivate change, and especially for men, that's something that's employed as a tool. And I think with genuine belief that might be effective. But I think it's really important to know that 50 years of research about shame has suggested that it's actually precisely the opposite, that it actually discourages people from changing behaviors that are self-destructive or harmful to other folks. So what we've learned is that when boys feel threatened or vulnerable, they often opt for coping strategies that are allowable under those masculine norms. And they're often destructive to themselves or to other people. So they might use violence against themselves or others, or shaming behaviors towards others to deflect that sense of inadequacy or powerlessness. They might do numbing behaviors like addiction to work, addiction to food or exercise or substances, drugs and alcohol certainly. But there are other kinds of addictions and behaviors that fall into that category that might not be so easily identified as problematic or related to trauma histories. And then there's the other piece of isolation that, just shutting down, being quiet and silent, the strong silent types, that's often missed as a symptom of possible reaction to trauma. But I guess the question then is, should we be surprised in any way that a lot of those traumatized boys and men grow up and lead lives that we look at them, we see them as choosing violence or choosing addictions or choosing homelessness. And really, on some level, we haven't given them enough options, and I think that's what we're going to talk about today. So, I think that's why you're next up, but I could be wrong. Okay, I'm wrong. So what is trauma? There's a lot of different definitions of trauma, and we've got a number of them here. But people view this in different ways. We'll talk later about the ACE studies. I've had people who were clinically trained really talk about the difference between adverse childhood experiences and trauma. And I think what we're really focusing on is behaviors that have had a traumatic impact on people. So whether they fall within the absolute definition that SAMHSA offers or other agencies, or the APA has one. I think what we're really talking about today is experiences that have had a traumatic impact on young men and boys, and what the repercussions for that might be. So we've got SAMHSA's pretty formal, pretty complete definition here. Got one from Capacities, who was one of the people who really focused on secondary trauma back in the 90s. They really started, Gil Perlman and Capacities. And then, one that I use is just a threatened situation or event that's prompting a need to defend a person's physical or emotional safety or that of someone they love. So it doesn't have to be this huge event. It just has to be subjectively how they're feeling threatened.
And when we think about trauma, in three different series of actions. So first we have the event, the actual event or extreme threat of harm close to someone. And so then it's the experience. So with that experience, there comes the terror, the horror, the pain. And when you go through trauma, you experience the fight, flight, or freeze. That is a quick reaction on what should I do in this moment of being triggered, being a victim of violence. Do I fight? Do I flight? Do I freeze? And you also feel that period of helplessness to escape. And those feelings from trauma, it overwhelms the brain and the body. So the effect of that is disintegration and also dysregulation as well, which is a kind of a term that's used in the medical community to refer to emotional response that is poorly modulated. And so trauma is universal. Trauma, as I like to say, is long-term. So trauma is not 2 weeks, it's not 6 months, often it's not 2 years. Trauma shapes your worldview. In many cases for victims, trauma is long-term, and those have those lasting adverse effects on individuals, families, and communities. So we think about trauma, we think about the fight, flight, and freeze. So there are also some noticeable effects. When you are experiencing trauma, your pupils may dilate, your mouth becomes dry, your neck and your shoulders muscles tense, your heart starts pumping faster, faster, and faster. And you begin being able to get those chest pains. You're constantly sweating. So your body are going through these different types of emotions, physical emotions. You're breathing fast, shallow hyperventilation, and you're needing oxygen in your muscles, right? So those are some of the noticeable effects of trauma. But there are also some hidden effects to trauma when you're in that stage of fight, flight, and freeze. Your brain gets the body ready for action. And that adrenaline that you're receiving at that moment, it really helps your response on, are you going to fight, or are you going to flight? And so those hidden effects that we can't see are happening inside of the human body, where your blood pressure begins to rise, your liver releases glucose to provide that energy for your muscles, and your digestion slows or ceases, and your cortisol is released, and that really depresses the immune system as well. So your body, noticeable effects, and also so many hidden effects that we often don't talk about when someone is experiencing trauma.
So what we're going to do is talk about the lens that we use to interpret men's behavior or boys' behavior when we see them, and really when a man or a boy presents himself with some of those symptoms, some of those, both the hidden ones or the visible ones that Aswad has just been talking about, how do we respond to them? And one of the things that's been really striking to me in looking at programs around the country is understanding how much I've really come to believe that we know what we need to do, but that our own expectations and biases and assumptions about folks get in the way often of, how we respond to a given situation, how we view folks. You don't have the advantage of seeing me on screen, but I'm an old white Irish Catholic guy. And I recognize that I've moved through life with some real advantages, and that a lot of those are things that I've taken for granted, and that's my life experience. And in the 30 years I've been doing this work, I've started to see that people have been hearing very different messages and experiencing the interventions that I've suggested over the years in a very different way from how I intended them or how I interpreted them myself, and that they're actually not maybe the resources that they actually needed or that they actually wanted given their life experiences. So what I've discovered is that at the heart of most of this is survival, that people's behaviors are really often driven by a survival. And I noted that it's easier, it's really easy, and I was pretty good at it, of identifying other people's problems. And when I was doing child protection, I would create service plans that delineated what their problems were, what they needed to do to fix them. And what I eventually realized is a lot of what that I saw as problems were actually solutions to issues and survival demands that I couldn't even see. So what I've really learned over time is that we really need to look at ourselves and evaluate our own interpretations of things and just challenge how we view things, what our biases are, what our assumptions are. And if we really want to support change, we have to apply that different lens, their lens. We have to listen to what they need, to what their life experiences are, to the people that we're trying to help, and tailor our interventions to what is actually going to be meaningful given their life experience. So we've got a video here coming up, and I want to offer a trigger warning to it. It's a fairly emotional video. I certainly have I've seen it quite a few times, and I have an emotional response to it. There's not a lot of graphic, there isn't really any graphic descriptions in it, but it is pretty emotional, and it's something that really I think will help visualize that notion of what our biases and assumptions are. So if, Alicia, you could play the video for us. There was a question we had, if anybody is attending via a phone, you may not be able, you probably won't be able to hear this because this is where you have to switch to your computer speakers. So it won't.
Hi, everyone. So I'm looking at the attendee list, and I don't think we're going to have an issue with anyone only listening over the phone today. But if you are on the phone, the audio will only play over your computer speakers. So if you're listening through your phone just for the duration of the video, can you please turn down your phone and turn up your computer speakers to hear the audio?
I was sexually abused when I was about 8 by an older male cousin.
I've been sexually assaulted on 4 different occasions.
I was 6 years old the first time that I was molested.
A neighbor named Hank took me into his house. And at first it was hugging, and then his hands traveled. And when I tried to push him away, he beat me. And then he raped me.
And I was haunted by the fact that this happened in a little girl's bedroom.
For a long time, I blamed myself. I was just angry because I'd go to school and nobody in school knew what was going on.
When I tried to tell my mom, she kicked me out of the house and laughed at me and told me I would never deserve anything better.
It became something that lasted until I was 17 years old.
I remember after it happened and after he left, sitting on a bed for a while, torn up and saying, I am never going to tell another living person about this. I went and got my friends, and I drove them home.
Thank you for reading that, Katrina.
Thanks.
Now, if you had the chance, how would you respond to this person's story?
I just feel like, or just like, hug her. And just let her know it's not her fault,
You were a little girl. It's not your fault, honey.
You actually have the chance to meet that person because they're here today. This is James Metters. This is Mark Godoy Jr. This is Isaac Andrade. This is Walter Castaneda. This is Glenn Hall. He served in the Army for 30 years, retiring as Command Sergeant Major. And what you just read is his story.
My name is Glenn.
What you just read was his story.
Oh my God.
How are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Doing good.
Thank you for reading my story.
I know the statistic is 1 in 6. I'll go into a room and I'll count 6 men. Like, there's somebody else in here. Yeah. And they're probably dealing with it the same way I've dealt with it, which is not talking about it.
To share the same experience, I was young and I was in college. I was sexually abused. You know, we don't talk about these things, but it happens, you know.
I grew up in a Latino household where
I know what that's like.
my dad telling me, no llores, cabrón. No eres vieja, you're not a girl, don't cry. And on the other side, you're getting abused and you don't know what to say.
I joined the Army to die. I was abused from the time I was born till I was 17.
Masculinity made me put away what I was feeling and not really deeply feel what had happened to me and recognize and acknowledge what happened to me.
Getting suspended in the 4th grade, getting in a fight, getting expelled from one high school, it's all part of the abuse. And it's all part of me, my child, my inner child acting out and starving for attention.
Mm-hmm. One of the reasons I rose in the rank of the military, they like tough guys. But inside I was dying.
Still makes me emotional. That what happened to me wasn't because of who I am. It was something that was done to me. It's not me.
I know a lot of males are too afraid to speak up, but I'm real open because I want to inspire the male survivors. That's not just males with disabilities, but also males without disabilities.
Yeah. I identify myself as a Black gay survivor. I had a lot of fear, and I just posted a link on Facebook saying, this is my story, if you want to read it, you can read it. And the response I got after that was nothing but kind.
Every time I share my story, especially as a man, I always hear back, hey, can I talk to you? Yeah, what's up? This happened to me too. This happened to me too. This happened to me too.
I'm not doing it just for myself. It's for many others whose voices not been heard before.
It's really hard not to cry. I'm really glad you've done the work, and I know that you changed somebody's life. So that's all I can say without crying.
You can survive it. You can get through it.
I think you're just so strong. Like, I don't know if you know it, but you're very strong.
Thank you.
It just makes you remember and realize that everybody has a story.
Okay. So it's a powerful presentation of just what those assumptions are and how we just view a situation, view a story, and how hard it is to apply those assumptions to boys and men and consider. I remember again when I was in child protection how difficult it was for a lot of social workers to recognize the signs of a boy who's been sexually abused who might be acting out by getting suspended or getting expelled, like one of these young men was, or the idea of joining the military to die. I think it's a really powerful or taking a step out on the street with a gun with the same thought in mind, with that sort of extreme risk taking that so many men engage in. So let's talk a little about what, I'm having a little trouble getting my, there we go. So what is it going to look like if somebody shows up at our door with that kind of lived experience or other kinds of trauma? There are a lot of different ways that sexual abuse is one of them. 1 in 6 is the statistic that is commonly accepted, but there are a lot of other different kinds of trauma that are going to affect the boys that you may be working with through the Lincoln system. And let's just think a little bit about how that might impact their basic beliefs about themselves and their worldview, as Swad was talking about earlier. The sense of, what does this mean? So much of it is about a sense of betrayal of an expectation of being safe that every child should have and has as a birthright. And any kind of trauma and abuse is a sense of betrayal, especially if it's by someone that was in a position where you believed you should be able to trust them. So what it raises is that question of, who am I? What does this mean? The world isn't safe. The people that I depend on can't be trusted. I have to protect myself. I have to find a means to do that because nobody else is going to do it. And what am I going to believe in? All of the talk that I've heard about good and evil doesn't really mean anything. So how do I reconcile what's happened to me? A lot of it comes out as an inability to trust. Just this sense of, if somebody has betrayed me in that way, or usually it's unexpected. So what are my terms for instilling trust and believing in somebody? Or if, on the contrary, you decide, okay, I just got to let go and trust everybody, you may put yourself in a position of being victimized again. So there's that basic capacity to really understand and read the world in that way has been disrupted. That sense of emotional stability, the extreme fluctuations, the difficulty modulating those feelings as they come and go. I think a lot of this is probably stuff you recognize, but I think it's important to just focus on it, especially in the context of working with boys and men. That sense of hyperarousal and what impact that's going to have, how that's going to manifest itself in their behaviors. That disassociation and the potential for self-harm. I'm sure a lot of you know that these suicide rates for boys, that boys are much more successful in suicide attempts, and that it's one of the leading causes of death among males. So it's something that we really need to pay attention to and look at that self-harm and look at what the antecedents for that are. Where's that behavior coming from? And how can we help change it and mitigate it? And, another thing that's really been disrupted here is relationships. And I think really, in many ways, this is the most important piece, is in restoring that sense of trust, that restoring that sense of stabilized emotions, is restoring that sense of connection. Because this kind of trauma really can make people feel like they don't know what's a good boundary. They're sort of reenacting what they've seen, what they've learned, especially if the trauma occurred when they were young or the violation of that boundary occurred when they were very young. It's really hard to know what's a safe relationship and how to establish a safe relationship and behave in a way that's safe towards others. Because if vulnerability triggers, when I was working with men who've been abusive to partners. So often, again, this trauma never, and we'll repeat this, past trauma never justifies or excuses abusive or violent behavior towards other people. But if we don't understand that that's where it's coming from, we're really going to miss the opportunity to help heal that past trauma and change that behavior. So here's some ways that this might show up for boys that either come into your office, that come into your court, that come into your school, that come into your athletic program. And if we just see these behaviors as signs of a bad character or a bad boy or a bad young man, we're really, again, going to miss the opportunity to engage with them in a way that actually gives them the opportunity to change these behaviors and heal. So it comes out in many different ways. Some ways that can be really challenging to us as providers or as teachers or as coaches or as probation officers or police officers. These behaviors can be really challenging and triggering for us. So that sense of self-awareness is going to be really important as you see these behaviors and how you interpret them. So Aswad's going to tell us about a case study of someone who's had these experiences and how those played out in his life.
Thank you, Peter. So through our work, we're going to working with young men, primarily young boys and men of color. So here we have William Johnson, who's a 14-year-old African-American male. He is the youngest son of 3 brothers. He's been being raised in a single-parent home. William lives in a poverty-stricken community with little opportunities to succeed in life. So no connections to any community programs. William is someone in the community that is vibrant, young men in the community, but don't have spaces for him to connect to community programs in this neighborhood. William also lives in a community surrounded by high poverty and violence. So William is exposed to violence often on a daily, often on a weekly basis in his community. And William, as a young African-American male, don't have any mentors or positive role models in his life, in his community. So William, I know many Williams throughout my work. I am a William. Many friends who are just teenagers and just want to be able to succeed in life, but don't have the opportunities to do those things. And primarily young men of color, we are often, the most harmed by violence, but we are the least supported. So William, as an African-American male, just graduated from middle school, is on his way to high school at the age of 14 years old. So William became a victim of a drive-by shooting. William suffered a gunshot wound to his face, and as a result of this near-fatal injury, William lost his left eye due to the shooting. So thinking about the trauma that William is going through, the physical pain of being a young male who was just in high school and became a victim of a drive-by shooting in this neighborhood while walking down the street. So William, as a victim of violence, after he's able to overcome those injuries, those non-fatal injuries, William is released from the hospital back into the same neighborhood where the shooting is happening at. So I want you all to think about, as Peter talked about how trauma, it shapes our worldview, but also trauma don't just impact the individual, trauma impacts the entire family. So William is released from the hospital with the loss of his sight in his left eye. William's family don't know how to deal with what they experience and how to help them heal, given that they were released from this hospital back into the same community where it happened at. Often, in many communities across the country, survivors have to continue to live in that place that they were victimized. So that trauma is a cycle of trauma that goes on every single day for many victims. And William, as a 14-year-old male, became a victim of violence. So the aftermath of violence that William experienced was flashbacks, nightmares, and insomnia. William is having trouble sleeping at night. He's often replaying the seconds, the minutes of that fateful night that he got shot. So during his recovery process, William starts to get paranoid. He starts to get angry, which is a natural reaction to when someone harms you. You want to harm someone else. So William is, while he's recovering, he's getting angry. He's having thoughts of retaliation. William wants the people that hurt him, he wants them to hurt the same way. But William is scared of leaving his house. William don't know who the individuals were that shot him, and so William begins to fall in a state of depression. And he's still feeling the intense physical pain from the headaches throughout the day, and William has to deal with this trauma on his own with little support to recover, little support from the hospital, little support from the community-based organizations, the victim advocates, and within law enforcement and the community. And William is just left to deal with this trauma and this pain on his own with him and his family. So not connected to any of the much-needed therapeutic services that all victims of violence must receive. But William is now blind in his left eye. So how is William going to be able to navigate the disability of him only having sight in his right eye? I want you all to think about Williams, the many Williams that you all will be meeting in the community who often became a victim of violence without the support that's needed to help them heal.
So even without, talking about the gun violence, which is the second leading cause of death for young people in both urban and rural settings in the country. So it's a really important feature and factor to take into account and discuss. So even without that, the reality is that most people and most boys and young men, in fact, have had some kind of traumatic experiences growing up anyways. And I'm guessing that most of you are familiar with the ACE studies, the adverse childhood experiences, so we won't spend a lot of time on it. But one of the things that I think is really important to highlight is, we're talking about 17,000 individuals who were insured by Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, California. And of those, they were asked about a number of different adverse childhood experiences, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. You probably know them all. How they treated violently. We'll get into them a little more. But what I think is really important to remember is that these were all people who had insurance. They were 70% white. They were largely middle class. There were none of the questions were asked about community violence, like being shot, like William, or seeing a friend or someone you're close to in your family being shot. Didn't ask about structural or historic racism. Didn't include interviews with people who were incarcerated or in addiction treatment programs or who were homeless, all of whom have higher rates, and subsequent evaluations have been found to have higher rates of adverse childhood experiences. So these numbers that we have are based on 70% white middle-class folks. And what they found was about a third, almost 30% of men who participated in that group had experienced physical abuse in their homes growing up. 16% had, that's 1 in 6, had experienced sexual abuse. Almost a quarter of them had experienced substance abuse in their homes. One of the pieces that always fascinates me is about the household mental illness, and I think it really speaks to sort of how men perceive emotional issues. And we're figuring we're a community of 51% women, 49% men. So you would assume that household mental illness should be pretty evenly divided, and yet the men reported only about a 15%, and the women in the survey reported about a 24%. So I think that's really something that's really struck me all along as indicative of how males view issues like emotional instability or mental illness. So here's a chart, a graphic depiction of this, and what we see here is that the more ACEs somebody has, and again, you probably all know this, that the higher the rate of a whole range of outcomes, negative outcomes, health outcomes, behavioral outcomes. I think what's really another thing that's really important to focus on here is, although this is a really eye-opening bit of information that it's really useful to engage people in the community, policymakers and practitioners, it's really important to stress when you deliver this ACE information that we're talking about a risk, an increased risk. We're not talking about an absolute sentence or an absolute fate that somebody who's had these, I've known a number of people who've had 10 ACEs, and their first reaction was, oh my God, I'm doomed. And really the truth is, if people get help and start to deal with that trauma history, that it can change those outcomes, and I think it's really important to stress that. So we've got a chart here that talks about the different things that can have an effect, the different ways that these ACEs can increase different outcomes. And Swad, you can talk a little about this. This is
yeah, but when we talk about the ACE, as Peter mentioned, it's a measure that we use, but we know that many children, thinking about children like William, who became a victim of violence, there's a cycle of violence that goes on in communities, and it's not uncommon for boys and young men of color who are victims of violence don't have the support services that they need in order to help them heal. So most young men in communities are left to deal with the impact of that violent crime on their own. So this graph here just shows how adverse childhood experiences and when someone becomes a victim of violence, where there's an individual is shot, stabbed, or assaulted, the common norm is that they're treated in the emergency room, often admitted to inpatient surgical services. Then, as William did discharge from the hospital back into their neighborhood, where the PTSD comes in. I like to say that, in many of the communities that I work in, the communities that I grew up in, there are a high percentage of undiagnosed PTSD in communities of color. Even for myself, I remember at the age of 12 years old, just walking in my neighborhood and hearing firecrackers and thinking those were gunshots, and immediately took safety under a car, right? And so that PTSD that's often not diagnosed in communities of color have a long-term traumatic impact for the rest of your life. So when you have individuals like William, who's a victim of gun violence, who's suffering from PTSD, who's suffering from those thoughts of anger, retaliation, in order to provide a sense of safety, William would like to and self-medicate by using drugs or abusing pills. Often many young men feel that they need to protect themselves because nobody's going to do it for them. So that could result in getting a weapon, which also increases increase the rate of retaliation, also them becoming a victim of violence again, and so often that leads to death in jail. So that's how the cycles of violence shows up primarily for boys and young men of color who are victims of gunshots, stabbings, and assault. But we know that this graph can look different for many other types of victimization. So the same cycle may not be the case for male victims of domestic violence or male victims of sexual assault. And so we have to look at different ways to treat individuals' needs, not always providing general services. And so if we're able to create those opportunities to hear and talk to young men who are experiencing violence, and being able to have that safe space for them to talk about the traumatic events in their life. And so we have a huge opportunity to do something different and being able to help that we have those programs that are tailored to male victims of violence. And often what I like to say, one of my lifetime goals is, I want to see more male support groups for victims. That's something that, that I don't see in the work that I'm doing. When I became a victim of violence, there wasn't a support group available for me. So some of the tangible things that we can do to make sure that male victims of violence voices are being heard and that they have, a community that can help them heal as well.
Okay, so let's look at what interventions are going to be effective and work with people who've had that level of trauma. And really what we're discovering is that, in the ACE studies, and again, this only addresses certain kinds of adverse childhood experiences. It doesn't address a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of kids who've grown up with experiences like William. But about 2/3 of males in the ACE studies had some kind of adverse, at least one. And 1 in 10 had more than 4. So you look around the room, and again, we're talking about white middle class people with insurance. 1 in 10 of them had at least 4, which put them at higher risk for a whole host of outcomes, including drug addiction, depression, suicide. So you add in those other kinds of trauma, and you really, you look in a room of 10 boys or 10 young men, and you think, okay, what do we got here? What are we dealing with? What are the behaviors that we're seeing might be reflecting something that's happened to them. So one of the things that we really suggest is kind of a universal precaution approach. Assume that there's some trauma response operating, that, what you're seeing is probably a reaction, that a lot of their behaviors, and especially the difficult, I always say when I see somebody behaving in a way that makes me go, what the hell are you doing? It's usually a survival mechanism, a maladaptive survival mechanism that I don't understand, that I can't even see the risk that was active in the moment, but that actually if I start to interpret through that lens, it really changes things. And I guess the other really important piece of the trauma-informed lens is that healing involves establishing a sense of empowerment and safety. So the safety piece is, I think, is the thread that runs through everything. And it has to be safety without imposing that shame or that violence on somebody else. It can't be, I'm going to be safe so you're not. But the healing part of it is about empowerment and safety. And if we can really sort of craft interventions that keep those awarenesses in place, we'll really move forward, I think, much more quickly. Now, this is a quick chart. I'll skim through this quickly, but this is a study of how long it takes men to disclose versus how long it takes women to disclose sexual abuse. And what you see here is that it's often 10 or 20 years longer for men to disclose abuse than for women to disclose abuse. And of course, some of both men and women, and we've seen this in recent years and recent weeks with the whole Me Too movement, sort of freeing up the people's voices to actually talk about and feel like they have a right to disclose and talk about their trauma histories. You know, what's interesting about this is I've also seen another study, a follow-up study of men who were medically treated in childhood for sexual assault or sexual abuse. And when they were interviewed in their 40s and 50s, most of them denied any history of abuse. So it really speaks to that notion that men bury it. And the real problem here is that buried traumatic stress comes out in other ways, and sometimes they're not very pretty. So one of the real advantages to my fellowship has been traveling to different programs around the country, and in one of them I met this woman, Dr. Thea James, in the Boston Medical Center. She started a violence intervention program back in 2006. And what she recognized was that she was seeing a lot of the individuals who were coming into their emergency room. She was an emergency room doctor. A lot of the young men who were coming in with gunshot and stab wounds were people they'd seen before. And they'd patch them up and send them out back into the community. And at some point she realized that they were treating the wounds and injuries that they could see through the lens they were using, but that they were really missing out on a lot. And so they started a program where they've provided follow-up services for anyone who's been a victim of gunshot or stabbing. They provide counseling to that individual and to their family, and they provide job counseling and housing support. And they've really just realized that they need to treat a much deeper level of trauma than just the stab or the gunshot wound. And they've actually been having some great success in not having people who've been victimized in that way return. But this is a quote that she said when I was talking to her one day, and it really speaks to me, and I think speaks to what we're talking about, this idea that, you know, people want to be healthy, people want to heal. If you're seeing someone behaving in a way that, you know, it looks like they're not interested in that, there's probably a different explanation. And if you dig a little and ask them, then you can find out what it is, and you can actually be much more effective at the whatever intervention that you employ and bring on board. So there's some guiding principles. Again, I'm guessing that you all are familiar with these, so we won't dwell on them, but safety is the thing that runs through everything for me. I just feel like so much of what I see in people who've experienced trauma is just the effort to restore a sense of safety. And it really is basic, and I think in the forefront of every interaction. And I always say that the most effective intervention we can undertake is to provide a safe connection. And that's going to be more important than any medication, any housing, anything specific that we provide, just that sense, because trauma has violated that sense of safe connection. To the extent that we can restore that, our interventions are going to be most successful. And I think Swad.
Yep, and also trustworthiness and transparency is very important in this work that we're doing. You know, most of you all are part of the screening process, so that's trust that has to be built. Not only as an organization, but also building trust with clients and family members of those individuals receiving services. So we talked about the need for making sure that children and families are connected to services in the communities that are going through the screening process. So being able to build that relationship with survivors is very important in this work that we're doing. So throughout the organization at all levels, there must be trust and also transparency about the goals of what we're trying to do by linking systems of care for children and youth family victims.
Gentlemen, we've got about probably a little less than 15 minutes left for presentation time if we're going to reserve some time for questions.
Okay, good to know. We'll buzz through and see what folks have to say. If we don't have any questions, we'll resurrect some of the information if we jump over it. So, but I'm hoping that y'all have some questions and that we can get some conversation going. So go ahead, Aswad.
Thanks, Peter. So just most of you have seen some of these guiding principles, trauma-informed care, so I won't spend too much time on these principles. Just, peer support and mutual self-help is always very important in this work that we're doing at all levels. Also collaboration and mutuality. There is true partnering and leveling of power differences between staff and clients and among organizational staff from direct care to administrators. So collaboration is very important to make sure that we are not duplicating services and also being able to partner more in this work that we are doing. Another one of the important guiding principles, empowerment, voice, and choice. And so you all will always hear me talk about elevating the voices of survivors in this work that we're doing. So it's great to see on the chat box that many of you are thinking of ways to include more youth and more male victims' voices, experiences in your work. And also the cultural, historical, and gender issues. So Peter, you want to talk a little bit about the importance of us as healers, the importance of us as service providers on why us being, understanding, cultural stereotypes and biases as well.
Yeah, I think, again, as an old white guy, I think it's really been an eye-opener for me over the years to understand how important it is for me to, I always felt like every family that I worked in child protection had a culture of its own, and it was a combination of many different things, and if I saw them based on one identity or one aspect of who they were, one characteristic, I was going to make a real mistake and make some assumptions that probably weren't going to be accurate. And so really expanding what we see as cultural and historical and gender issues is really important, because that intersectional piece of where all those different identities and issues come forward. And again, as an older white man who life experience hasn't included a lot of the historic traumas that have been passed down, it's really important for me to evaluate myself and my organization's ability to see the life experiences of other folks. So we'll talk a little more about William.
Yeah, so thinking more about what, as I talked about, William was released from this community, released from the hospital back into this community without connected to any support services. So during his time of recovery, and also William having multiple ACEs scores, as Peter talked about earlier, William doesn't feel safe, and William was, made that harmful decision to get a gun for protection. During this time, William started smoking marijuana. He began to drink alcohol, and for years he suffered from that traumatic experience at the age of 14 years old without that help to support and heal. So by the time of William became 18 years old, William was involved in an armed robbery that resulted in another young man being shot twice in his back. And so the cycles of violence and the unaddressed trauma led to William making a decision that resulted in further harm. And unfortunately, after William was involved in that shooting, several months later, William himself became a victim of gun violence again, and now suffers from lifelong health complications as a result of this second incident of William being shot. So we only have a few more minutes. I want you all in the text box thinking about William. What intervention should have been available for William when he got shot at the age of 14? So I give it about 20 seconds to see some of the interventions to start coming in, as we continue with today's presentation. So continue to type in the text box. So what interventions should have been available for William once he left the hospital and was back into his community? So as we're thinking about interventions, to help stop the cycles of crime, there should have been home visits by the hospital or other community-based victim service providers that provides William with a comprehensive clinical case management plan that was also culturally competent and also in a sensitive manner as well. There should have been mental health services for William and his family who are suffering from trauma. And also William and his family should have been connected to a primary care, special care physician if needed. And, being able to help William's mom who had was taking care of her grandchildren at the time, there should have been resources to help his mom with child care assistance, and also being able to provide relocation support and stable housing for William at the age of 14 to get away from the community where he became a victim of violence. So throughout this time of William recovering, he could have been getting assistance through the Victims Compensation Program, obtaining filing state disability due to the loss of his eyesight, obtaining other health care services, and William should have been connected to a community-based organization that provided that case management services, but also having a single point of contact for William and his family to address all his needs and also make other referrals to organizations as needed, and being able to help William get back into school and potentially get access to youth employment after his recovery as well. So many interventions could have been done for William, but unfortunately they wasn't when he became a victim of violence at the age of 14 and once again at the age of 18 years old after he shot another young man in his community.
All right, so really I see in the chat box, I see a question from Jess suggesting, saying they haven't really addressed the differences in how to engage men versus engaging women. And we've talked a lot about trauma and the impact of trauma. But I think it's really important to focus first the idea that a lot of that is going to have to do with our own assumptions. We've all grown up with socialization, expectations, assumptions. Our organizations have been formed with those assumptions and expectations. And how those play out both in our interactions. One of the things that I have always noticed is that men and boys who are seeking or toying around with the idea of asking for help will often present in a way that's testing the waters, and they actually present in a very provocative way. One of the guys in the domestic violence group I ran, the guy in his mid-50s, he was, what you'd consider a real tough guy. He was, had a pretty scary exterior posture, and every week he'd come in and he would start out the group by saying how ridiculous it was, how pointless it was, how he didn't need to be there, and how stupid the program we were providing was. And I got to the point where I almost found it laughable that he was doing this and responded that way. And as a result then, he became one of the most active members of the group. But he would continue to do this every week. And if I had reacted in a way that shut him down and reacted to that provocation, reacted to that insecurity or that testing the waters, I never would have seen that side of him. So that's one of the things that we often see with boys and young men is that they're really kind of nervous about exposing any kind of vulnerability because, as we talked about earlier, it's not safe. It's not, a boy that shows vulnerability is likely to be shamed, likely to be, at risk of being beat up or harmed in other ways or humiliated. So it's, again, what we have to do is create that safety, but within the framework of that masculine norm. So I think a lot of the skills that you would use in engaging males are in many ways the same norms that you would use in working with girls or women, but you have to sort of frame them within that context, within that framework of masculinity and the norms and the fears that men and boys are raised with, and to understand and read their behaviors and their responses to your efforts to form relationships with them. It may take longer. You may have to be more patient in listening to their stories and forming that relationship and creating a trusting interaction, a trusting connectedness before they're going to start to expose some of those vulnerabilities, because that is such a dangerous thing for boys and men to do, to expose that vulnerability. So, really I think talking to them in ways that reflect what they're feeling instead of assuming what they might be feeling or what in my mind, I might think they should be feeling, but they may not be. So really being careful. And I think you'll know that in terms of working with any client, but it's going to be more challenging in working with a boy or a young man, because our expectations about what vulnerability looks like are going to be very different. So that self-reflection is going to be really important, that establishing those connections without judgment, without an expectation or assumption about what vulnerability is going to look like, and to develop those practices that differentiate behavior from their experiences. And I'll talk briefly about one of the most useful tools that I've come across is using person-first language. It's something that was developed by people who have disabilities. And for instance, somebody who was labeled as being a schizophrenic wanted to be seen as someone who had schizophrenia, but this isn't the totality of who they are. And this is a really effective, although it's a little cumbersome to talk more about, instead of victims or survivors or perpetrators, or to talk about someone who's behaved in a way or somebody who's experienced a certain thing. It can really change the way. So if you're talking about someone who's been violent, rather than talking about a perpetrator, you just say somebody who's hurt or caused harm to another person. If you're talking about somebody who's been victimized, rather than talk about them as a victim, you talk about somebody who's experienced trauma. And it really changes both the way you view them, or we view them, and how they view themselves. So I'm going to spin through this next one because I know we're getting short of time. And I've talked a little about some of these: active listening, respect the coping mechanisms that they've developed that you may not understand as an effective solution to a problem, but try to understand what the problem. Vincent Folletti, I think, was one of the sources of that notion that he discovered, and he was one of the principal researchers for the ACE study. He said what he discovered was that a lot of what he saw as problems were actually solutions that people had come up with to deal with past trauma in ways that had gotten them to this point in their life. What they need is other options. So let's go to the next one. I think this is you, a slide. And then maybe we can move to the end.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So I'm wondering, given that we only have about 13 minutes left in the webinar, I would love to spend these next 13 minutes fielding some questions from the audience. Is there opportunity, Alicia, to open up the mic to hear any verbal questions that come in? Or Hunter, do you have any questions that have been filled in the chat box for us?
I think the best approach to that is just to remind folks that they can raise their hand if they'd like to be unmuted here at the end to verbally ask a question or have an exchange. So it's a pretty intuitive little raise the hand button, and that'll cause Alicia, our webinar guru, to be able to unmute you. But in the meantime, we have some questions that have accumulated that I've been keeping track of. And very importantly, one of them is from Michelle. And Michelle inspired us to pull this webinar together and to engage you in being presenters. So she very early asked on, are there ways to reverse the effects of trauma or ways to reduce trauma responses? And I think here at toward the end of the webinar, your presentation, you've gotten into that in a lot of depth. But is there anything you'd like to highlight for Michelle specifically in terms of trying to reverse a very unfortunate condition?
I think I would just, I think I've said this, so I'll be brief, but I really, really believe that establishing safe connection, feeling like you have a relationship with somebody that's going to be safe, well-bounded, that people are not going to, even if you test those boundaries, that you can be assured that the person, the provider that you're testing is not going to be reactive, not going to be harmful to you. To me, that is the most effective intervention in overcoming past trauma, is to reestablish that connection that got severed in that traumatic experience.
Yeah, I also think that if we're able to intervene very early in someone's life, that we can, being able to help, reverse those effects of trauma and being able to help stop the cycles of crime. But we must, put, the victims at the center of these conversations, of these programs. So just finding out ways to address things at the very, very early stage of victimization, so that trauma won't cause people to lash out, and that trauma don't linger for a very long time.
There's a really interesting back and forth in the chat about presenting this webinar to juvenile justice stakeholders in Montana, I believe, and also interest in Ohio. And do either of you have any experience in trying to present this topic with juvenile court judges, probation officers, detention, the stakeholders in the juvenile system?
Yeah, from my previous work as a case manager at the Connecticut Juvenile Training School, so a lot of the work was being able to get the juvenile attention to focus primarily more on trauma, because what I saw, my first few days on the job was actually reading the young men case files on kind of, what their life experiences were, and many of them were victims of violence, whether it's from seeing a friend shot and killed, or exposed to community violence, or being a victim of domestic and sexual assault. And so being able to, have these conversations and being able to be honest and transparent about that so many youth who come in contact with the juvenile justice system come there as a result of unjust trauma. So we must stop the cycles of violence, and if we put trauma-based interventions more in the juvenile justice system, so that once they are released from the facility, that they are better than when they went in the first time, and then we were able to create those programs and those safe spaces and build those relationships with youth to let them know it's okay to talk about trauma. It's okay to talk about experiences that they went to, but we must link them to the services to help them deal with that trauma as well.
Yeah, my experience has been also that people in juvenile justice, people in law enforcement, that people in the courts or corrections are really open to hearing about different ways of approaching and understanding what might be at the heart of behaviors. I think so often, we talked about the shaming tendency. We talked about sort of the provocation and the reaction to the provocation. If you have just a limited set of ideas about, well, how do I respond to that when somebody tells me to go to hell? What am I supposed to do? How do I, the idea that there might be another explanation, another way to read that, another way to respond to it that actually is going to be more effective. So I think presenting it in ways that's going to improve their ability to do their work in ways, because as we talked about at the beginning about why we do this work, I think folks in those programs are doing the work for the same reasons. They want to create a safer society. They want to support healthy families. They want to do many of the things that are going to create a better and safe community. And if we're showing them that we have other tools to do that, I think they're often very receptive. But they've often been told that there are only, these are the tools you have, these are the things you have to do. So getting by that, again, it's that self-reflection about what are my biases, what are my expectations, what are my assumptions. And that can sometimes be the biggest challenge.
Okay, additional questions? We'll give it a little bit of time. We've got about 5 minutes left.
Hey, Hunter, it's Michelle.
Oh, great. Welcome.
Hi,
hey,
Michelle.
Thanks, Aswan and Peter. This is great. So I think that Joe and I had similar questions, so I'll read them both. My question is, how might linking systems of care sites begin to engage male populations through screening given resistance, possibly due to some protective factors that they may have? How can we begin concerted efforts to reach male populations? And then Joe's question was that that they've noted some gaps in their survivor and families work groups, that Black male victims of trauma and crime in youth and childhood, that they need both representation from straight and gay males. And she was wondering, what are some obvious places to begin to reach out?
Well, I think yeah. Well, I was going to respond to the first question a little. Of course, it went out of my head. So what was the first question, Michelle? Sorry.
It was just about how linking systems of care sites might begin a concerted effort to reach male populations.
Yeah, I think I would really focus on that, building relationships, building, that sense that it's going to take a little bit longer for men and boys to feel comfortable. I mean, there's so many effective programs I hear around the country where you form a group around, something that's unrelated to trauma, unrelated to an experience of abuse or neglect or whatever, that you build up those relationships, and that's why I spoke earlier about having peer groups and group programs for boys to talk. It always struck me in my domestic violence groups, once there was a safe environment, that men really want to talk, that they're really open to talking once they feel safe and that they're not going to be judged, but it takes them a long time to get there. And if we sort of give up I remember hearing about a program in, well, there's a great story about a program that was historically focused on domestic violence and treating people women who had been victimized primarily in domestic violence incidents, and they were starting to try to engage males. So they're living in a city, and they have a clinic that people come to, and they were doing outreach to boys in the community, and some of the boys came to the door and asked if they could use the bathroom. And their first reaction was, historically, we don't let males into this program. And they realized that here this was an opportunity to form a relationship, to sort of indicate to these boys that they were trustworthy. And, they could accomplish that while still taking precautions and recognizing that they needed to be safe with anybody who came into the program. But that awareness that really what we're doing is trying to build relationships and a sense of safety, and then that stuff will come to the surface.
Thank you. So what we should be telling our pilot communities and people who are administering our screeners is that basically hang in there, that sometimes you have to ask the question several times over the course of several different encounters to kind of get these victims to open up.
Or not even ask the question, just to form the relationship.
Just to form the relationship.
That's the real challenge, because you may not have a lot of time, you may not have the opportunity to form that relationship, but that's going to be really the key.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for that clarification.
Another huge important thing is listening. Listening and building that relationship, and so being able to have conversations that's not centered around their trauma or victimization. What is your favorite sport? What do you like to do for fun? So being able to focus on the positive things in the individual to help build that relationship is very important. And listening to see, they will tell you what they need during the conversation. So, if you have an open mind and be able to listen and focus on the positive things about them, men are more willing to open up and build that trust with you.
Thank you both. Joe, did you get your question answered?
Joe's typing. Okay, well, and let's advance to the last slide so everyone has Oswald and Peter's email address so that they can, start a dialogue directly with them. Please do the feedback survey so we can improve. And our next webinar will be December 6th, and it'll be exploring the Research Center for Victims. And please thank Oswald and Peter. They really worked hard on this the last month or so from scratch. And thank you, Michelle, for suggesting it to begin with.
And we really appreciate you all coming and spending the time considering this issue. And certainly, I think I can speak for Aswad that we'd be happy to answer any questions, support you in any way that would be useful to figure out how to engage boys and young men more effectively.
Yep, and just thank you all. And before we get off the call, I just want to share that. So William Johnson is someone that I think about every day of my life. When I got shot 9 years ago, William was the individual that shot me and ended my basketball career. And I like to say that if William, at the age of 14, if he received the help and support that he needed to deal with that trauma, then I don't think I would have never got shot, and I would be overseas playing basketball today. So I want you all to think about the many Williams that you are going to interact with, and that the importance of providing those healing support and trauma support services for individuals like William to help stop the cycles of crime.
Thank you. That's right.
thank you both. And it seems like there's a lot of interest, so you'll expect emails.
Okay. Look forward